Chapter 1. The Arrival of Jigsaw. Jigsaw sat in his command chair, eyes glued to the viewing screen as Earth came into focus. From a distance, it looked like any other life-bearing planet he'd surveyed. Blue oceans, green continents, swirling white clouds. The Zephosian galactic explorer had charted dozens of worlds, but this one, tucked away in a quiet corner of the Milky Way, was unlike any he'd encountered. The data suggested a highly oxygenated atmosphere, ample vegetation, and complex ecosystems. It seemed ripe for exploration, and his superiors had been intrigued. "Activate landing protocols," he ordered, his voice echoing through the compact cabin. His ship, a streamlined silver vessel named Mara, responded instantly, adjusting its trajectory toward a sprawling continent blanketed with dense forests and towering mountains. Jigsaw selected a landing site near what appeared to be a river, knowing that water sources were the best place to observe wildlife. The thick atmosphere caused a bumpy descent, but Mara touched down smoothly, its landing gear sinking gently into the soft, loamy ground. As the ship's engines wound down, Jigsaw activated his scanners. To his surprise, they were almost overwhelmed with the diversity of life forms clustered around the forest's edge. He couldn't help but feel a thrill. Primitive life was often the most fascinating, untouched by the destructive hands of advanced civilizations. Jigsaw donned his exploration suit, a sleek gray ensemble equipped with sensory enhancements and protective shields. Zephosian physiology wasn't particularly robust, relying instead on technology to compensate for physical limitations. He grabbed his data recorder, stepped into the airlock, and with a whirring of gears, the outer hatch opened, letting in a gust of humid, fragrant air. "Scanning initiated," he murmured, as a holographic display projected from his wrist console, mapping the area around him. Jigsaw noted the dense forest's alien beauty, the massive ferns, the towering cycads, and an array of brilliantly colored flowers, all basking in the dappled sunlight. The initial readings fascinated him. There was no sign of intelligent life, but the diversity of the plant and animal population was unlike anything he'd encountered before. Small, bird-like creatures flitted through the trees, chirping with complex songs that piqued his curiosity. "Note to self, the air is invigorating," he recorded, his voice carrying a hint of awe. "The ecosystem here appears rich and teeming with life. It's remarkably primal." He strolled through the foliage, activating a hovering probe that would follow him and document his findings. The probe floated in silence, capturing 3D holographic images of every plant and creature Jigsaw encountered. He took samples of the flora and cataloged insect-like life forms that darted across the forest floor. Each discovery added to his excitement. Earth felt like a lost paradise, untouched by civilization. But then, as he approached a particularly dense thicket, his radar began picking up an anomaly. Jigsaw paused, frowning. The readings were unusual, vague, yet powerful. He adjusted his scanner settings, but the readings only grew more perplexing. Whatever it was, it seemed to be moving, and moving toward him. "Perhaps it's a larger herbivore," he mused, unfazed. Primitive worlds often hosted oversized animals, and his shielding technology should keep him protected from any rudimentary threats. He activated the probe's defensive protocols just in case, still more intrigued than alarmed. Continuing his observations, Jigsaw became engrossed in documenting a cluster of glowing fungi. But then, a low, rumbling sound drifted through the air. It was distant but deep, resonating in a way that unsettled him. The ground trembled slightly, and a cascade of leaves fluttered down from the treetops. Jigsaw glanced around, feeling a sudden chill despite the humid atmosphere. Strange. That almost sounded like... The ground shook again, this time with more force, as the rumbling grew louder and more insistent. In the far distance, through the thick ferns and underbrush, he spotted movement, something large, something massive, pushing through the trees like they were no more than grass. As he watched, mesmerized, the creature emerged, a towering beast with leathery scales, teeth as long as his forearm, and a muscular tail that thudded against the ground. Its eyes locked onto him, predatory and filled with a hunger that sent a spike of terror down his spine. "Initiate defensive protocol," Jigsaw barked, his voice strained as he activated his energy shield. forming a shimmering barrier around himself. The creature, a Tyrannosaurus rex, though he didn't know its name, let out a bellowing roar, a primal sound that drowned out the whir of his probe. Jigzar's heart raced as he took a step back, feeling the heat of the creature's breath even through his shield. The T-Rex stomped forward, each step shaking the ground like a tremor. The readings on Jigzar's wrist console spiked. He didn't need the data to tell him he was in danger. All his training, all his experience on other worlds, had not prepared him for this. With a final, menacing roar, the creature lunged. Instinct took over as Jigzar bolted, ducking into the underbrush, the T-Rex's monstrous jaws snapping shut mere inches from where he'd stood. His pulse pounded in his ears as he sprinted through the dense foliage, dodging fallen branches and tangled vines, desperate to put distance between himself and the predator. The T-Rex crashed through the jungle after him, undeterred, driven by raw instinct and hunger. "First log entry," he gasped into his recorder, words spilling out in a frantic rush. "This planet is far from primitive, and it seems I have severely underestimated its inhabitants." Behind him, the earth shook with every pounding step of the beast, the chase marking the beginning of an adventure Jigzar would never forget. Chapter 2. A Jurassic Welcome. Jigzar's heart raced as he sprinted through the dense jungle, trying to keep ahead of the deafening footsteps of the creature that had ambushed him. Every step shook the ground, sending small stones tumbling and causing the foliage to tremble. He risked a glance over his shoulder and instantly regretted it. The T-Rex was gaining on him, its massive jaws snapping shut with a bone-rattling force. He was no longer the explorer, he was now the hunted. "Come on, Jigzar, think," he muttered, skidding around a massive tree trunk. His mind raced through his training, searching for any knowledge that might help. It was almost absurd. Advanced technology from Xiphos was no match against the sheer, primitive power of this beast. His survival instincts took over as he veered to the left, hoping to lose it among the thick undergrowth. Jigzar reached down to his utility belt and activated his scanner, hoping it might help him find a safe path. But instead of a clear route, his wrist console flashed with an array of red warning signals. There wasn't just one large predator in the area. The entire forest was alive with dangerous creatures of varying sizes. Some were slower, like the T-Rex, while others moved with the stealth and speed of predators accustomed to the hunt. As he sprinted through the underbrush, another sound joined the cacophony of thundering footsteps. A distant but unmistakable roar, this time from a different direction. Jigzar's eyes widened. Another predator? His luck couldn't be worse. He dashed forward, desperately scanning his surroundings for shelter. His suit's energy shield would only hold up for a few more impacts, and he had no intention of testing its limits against the teeth of another monstrous carnivore. Just ahead, Jigzar spotted a cluster of thick, gnarled tree roots forming a sort of natural barrier. With a burst of adrenaline, he dove into the gap, scrambling to press himself as far back as possible. The roots partially hid him, but his pounding heartbeat threatened to give him away. He activated his cloaking device, which, while not entirely reliable, might help him blend into the surroundings just enough to evade detection. The T-Rex stomped into view, sniffing the air and scanning the ground for its escaped prey. Jigzar held his breath, watching the colossal creature search with unrelenting determination. The T-Rex's massive, scaly head swung from side to side, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed, clearly aware that its quarry was close by. Jigzar felt a trickle of sweat run down his temple. If the creature found him, his cloaking device would do little to stop its claws and teeth. The T-Rex let out a frustrated roar, its deafening voice reverberating through the forest, scaring flocks of small, bird-like creatures into the sky. After several tense moments, it finally moved away, its heavy footsteps fading into the distance. Jigzar exhaled, his hand shaking as he powered down his cloaking device. The ordeal was far from over, but for now, he had a moment to gather his thoughts. After taking a few breaths, he assessed his situation. His ship was a few kilometers behind him, and returning there would require crossing territory he now knew was patrolled by apex predators. He couldn't call for backup. His distress signal, which he'd set to transmit when he'd first spotted the creature, had now been jammed by the dense canopy. He was truly on his own. Jigsaw activated his wrist console, scanning for potential resources he could use to navigate this hostile world. The scanner's display revealed something promising: a nearby water source. Rivers and lakes typically hosted a variety of life, and with luck, he might find some safer species there. More importantly, the water source would offer a place to regain his strength and strategize a safer route back to Mara. Keeping low, Jigsaw moved through the jungle as stealthily as possible, hyper-aware of every rustle in the trees and every distant call. The path was littered with enormous ferns and vibrant, towering cycads that reminded him of ancient Xiphosian flora. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and the unfamiliar sounds kept his nerves taut. As he approached the river, he began to understand that this world was a cycle of survival, where every creature, large or small, fought for dominance. Upon reaching the riverbank, Jigsaw scanned the surroundings carefully. He spotted several creatures on the far side, large, gentle-looking animals with long necks and sturdy legs, grazing on the plants that grew along the water's edge. They reminded him of some of Xiphos's larger herbivores, but on an exaggerated scale. He realized he was looking at a herd of sauropods, some of the largest herbivores on the planet. These creatures look relatively harmless, he noted aloud, recording his observations. They moved in unison, keeping close to one another for protection. Jigsaw began to feel a sliver of relief. Perhaps he could safely study them from a distance. He watched the creatures drink from the river, their necks bending gracefully as they reached down to the water. But before he could continue his observation, another sound filled the air, a high-pitched shrill screech, followed by a series of rapid thumps. Jigsaw froze, his heart sinking. Emerging from the underbrush, a pack of raptors, sleek, agile predators with sickle-like claws, raced toward the herd. The sauropods reacted instantly, letting out deep, rumbling calls of distress as they attempted to flee. Chaos erupted on the riverbank. The raptors moved with terrifying coordination, one of them circling behind to cut off any escape route for the slower sauropods. Jigsaw watched, captivated and horrified, as the predators launched their assault, moving with a level of precision that seemed almost calculated. The air filled with dust and the scent of crushed foliage, as the sauropods fought to defend themselves. Without warning, one of the sauropods, panicked and desperate to escape, charged in Jigsaw's direction. He scrambled to the side, narrowly avoiding being trampled by the creature's massive feet. Another sauropod swerved, crashing into a tree and causing branches to rain down around him. Jigsaw barely had time to react as one of the raptors, noticing the commotion, turned its piercing gaze toward him. "Oh no, stay focused on the sauropods," he whispered, backing away. But it was too late. The raptor let out an alerting screech, and within seconds, two of its packmates had diverted their attention from the herd and turned to face him. Jigsaw knew he had only seconds before they would close in. He quickly reached into his utility belt, retrieving a plasma grenade, a powerful but unpredictable tool meant for emergencies. As the raptors began their approach, he tossed the grenade toward a nearby rock, hoping the blast would be enough to deter them. The grenade exploded in a flash of searing light, sending shards of rock and earth into the air. The raptors skittered back, momentarily stunned by the explosion. Seizing the moment, Jigsaw ran along the riverbank, his eyes scanning for any possible refuge. He finally spotted a series of overhanging cliffs further downstream. Using every ounce of strength, he pushed himself to reach the cliffside and climbed a few meters up, finding a narrow ledge where he could catch his breath. From his vantage point, he looked out over the chaotic scene below. The sauropods had managed to evade the raptors, who, frustrated and injured from the explosion, turned and retreated back into the forest. Jigsaw slumped against the rock wall, breathing heavily, his mind reeling. "This planet," he muttered to himself, watching the forest settle into an eerie calm once again. "It's not just primitive, it's dangerous." Jigsaw realized that every creature here, from the mightiest predator to the smallest prey, was locked in a relentless battle for survival. And in this brutal world, he was merely an intruder, a foreigner, out of his depth. As he gazed out over the primal landscape, one thought echoed in his mind. Survival was going to be far more difficult than he ever anticipated. Chapter 3. Survival Instincts. Jigsaw perched on the narrow ledge, staring down at the remnants of the chaos below. The sauropods had fled into the deeper forest, and the raptors had slunk back into the shadows, but the adrenaline from his close encounter with Earth's predators still raced through him. His advanced tech felt woefully inadequate in the face of these primordial creatures. Here, brute strength, speed, and cunning were the ultimate survival tools, and he needed to adapt fast if he wanted to stay alive. He shifted carefully, testing the stability of the ledge, and activated his wrist console to assess his equipment. A status screen appeared, blinking with various warnings. The plasma grenade he'd just used was one of only a few he'd brought with him, and his energy shield was down to half power. The shield had absorbed enough impact to crack in multiple places, rendering it vulnerable to even the lightest future hits. His rations and water were also limited. He had brought enough for a standard survey mission, not an extended survival ordeal. "This is far from ideal," Jigsaw muttered, noting each item in his inventory as he worked to formulate a plan. Returning tomorrow without a strategy wasn't an option. His ship was deep within a predator-infested jungle, and he couldn't afford another encounter like the last one. He needed to be smarter about this. Carefully, Jigsaw climbed down from the cliffside, using thick vines and branches to support himself until he reached the forest floor. His immediate surroundings were quiet, but he knew the silence could be deceptive. Earth's hunters were stealthy and keenly aware of their territory. He needed to find a defensible spot, somewhere he could regain his bearings, think clearly, and perhaps even get a few hours of sleep. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the dense forest. He scanned the area for any suitable shelter and eventually spotted a fallen tree, its roots sticking out from the ground and creating a small alcove beneath it. The gap wasn't large, but it was enough to shield him from sight and perhaps keep smaller predators at bay. Crouching low, Jigsaw crawled into the hollow, pulling a few branches across the entrance to camouflage himself. He set his wrist console to low-frequency surveillance mode, activating motion sensors to alert him of any nearby movement while conserving power. Satisfied with his makeshift shelter, he took a deep breath and let himself relax, if only slightly. "Mission log entry," he whispered, activating his voice recorder. "The native wildlife presents far greater threats than initial scans indicated. Predators are exceptionally large, coordinated, and highly adaptable. My technological resources are limited and dwindling. To survive, I will need to adapt as well." He paused, feeling the weight of his situation settle over him. He had trained for survival missions, of course, but that training hadn't included defending himself against creatures capable of overpowering even his highest-grade shielding. The primal ferocity of Earth's ecosystem was as foreign to him as anything he'd ever encountered, and yet he couldn't help but feel a strange fascination with it. Before he could delve deeper into his thoughts, a faint rustling sound came from nearby. Jigsaw's pulse quickened as his motion sensor blinked to life, signaling movement a few meters away. He held his breath, straining his senses to detect any sign of danger. The sound was light, rhythmic, and growing steadily closer. Whatever was approaching wasn't moving with the stealth of a predator. It was likely something smaller. Jigsaw peered through the branches and spotted a small creature scurrying across the forest floor. It looked like a primitive, feathered animal, no bigger than his hand, with bright eyes and sharp claws. He recognized it from his earlier scans. It was a species of dinosaur, though a far less dangerous one. Jigsaw felt a strange relief. He could finally observe something up close without fearing for his life. Fascinated, he tapped his recorder and began documenting. Small carnivorous species resembling an ancient predatory bird, agile and cautious, likely opportunistic in its feeding habits. He watched as the creature scratched at the ground, unearthing tiny insects and snatching them up with quick, precise movements. The creature darted away after a few minutes, leaving Jigsaw to his thoughts once more. The encounter left him feeling both awe and humility. He was surrounded by ancient life forms that had adapted and survived in this environment long before his species had even considered interstellar travel. If he wanted to make it through this ordeal, he'd have to find ways to incorporate some of that instinctual survival wisdom into his own actions. As darkness fully settled, Jigsaw activated his suit's night vision, casting the forest in an eerie green glow. The jungle was even more intimidating at night. The shadows were deeper, and the sounds of nocturnal creatures filled the air. He tried to ignore the distant calls of predators, some echoing across the treetops, others seeming to come from the underbrush itself. Each sound served as a reminder of the relentless life cycle he'd stumbled into. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but he knew he had to ration his supplies. He took a small bite from one of his nutrient bars, forcing himself to save the rest for later. His water was more concerning. He had just enough to last another day, and he knew he couldn't rely on his ship's filtration system for much longer. As he chewed, Jigsaw considered the river he'd encountered earlier. It was the only reliable water source he'd found, but it was also a hotspot for dangerous activity. Still, he would have no choice but to risk another visit if he wanted to refill his water supply. His motion sensor blinked again, and Jigsaw froze. This time the reading was stronger, larger. It was no small scavenger passing by, but something substantial. He tensed, his hand hovering over the control for his shield as he carefully peeked out of his hiding place. A shadow loomed, its elongated neck and massive body silhouetted against the dim moonlight. It was a towering herbivore, one of the sauropods he had seen earlier. It moved slowly, seemingly unaware of his presence, its large feet pressing into the ground with rhythmic, ponderous steps. Jigsaw felt a surge of relief. The creature posed no immediate threat. He relaxed and watched it in awe, noting the gentle, almost methodical way it moved, oblivious to the dangers around it. The creature lowered its head, grazing on a patch of ferns with a peacefulness that seemed at odds with the constant survival struggle in the jungle. For a moment, Jigsaw felt a strange kinship with the creature. They were both vulnerable beings, simply trying to endure on a planet that was far more hostile than it seemed. The moment of calm, however, was short-lived. The sauropod suddenly froze, its head snapping up as it emitted a low warning rumble. The air seemed to thicken with tension, and Jigsaw's motion sensor blinked frantically, detecting multiple entities moving rapidly in his direction. His stomach dropped. The raptors were back, and in greater numbers. The sauropod let out a bellowing call as it bolted, its massive body crashing through trees in a desperate attempt to escape. Jigsaw watched in horror as the raptors closed in, their sleek, agile forms darting through the underbrush with terrifying precision. He pressed himself deeper into his shelter, praying the predators wouldn't detect him. But one of the raptors veered from the herd's trail, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. Its yellow eyes narrowed, focusing on the alcove where Jigsaw hid. His heart raced as he activated his energy shield, readying himself for another confrontation. The raptor tilted its head, letting out a low growl as it inched closer, testing his shield with a swipe of its claws. Jigsaw knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. He took a deep breath, bracing himself, and made a decision. He activated another plasma grenade and tossed it out of his shelter, directing it toward a nearby thicket. The grenade exploded, filling the air with bright light and deafening sound. The raptor shrieked, momentarily blinded by the blast. Seizing the opportunity, Jigsaw scrambled out of his shelter and dashed into the jungle, sprinting as fast as his legs could carry him. His surroundings blurred as he ran, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind him. As he darted through the trees, his mind focused on one clear goal: survival. He was no longer the curious explorer, but a desperate being trying to outwit predators in their own world. The thought was as terrifying as it was humbling. Chapter 4. The Predator's Playground. Jigsaw's lungs burned as he sprinted through the dense forest, glancing back only to see shadows and flashes of movement. The raptors were persistent, their agile bodies weaving through trees and leaping over obstacles with ruthless coordination. His own stamina was flagging. He wasn't used to such prolonged, high-intensity physical exertion. But the primal survival instincts he'd awakened were what kept him going, propelling him forward into the darkness. Ahead, the jungle thinned slightly, revealing a steep cliff that dropped down to a dense river valley below. He barely slowed, skidding to a stop at the cliff's edge, his mind scrambling for a solution. The raptors were still closing in, and this ledge offered no escape. As he weighed his options, he spotted a series of vines cascading over the cliffside. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only way down. Jigsaw grabbed hold of a sturdy vine, took a deep breath, and began his descent, praying that it would support his weight. The raptors arrived just as he'd slipped out of reach, their fierce screeches echoing through the forest above. Clinging tightly to the vine, Jigsaw quickly rappelled down, his arms straining with each movement. He descended several meters before his grip weakened, forcing him to brace himself as he released the vine and dropped to the ground below. He landed hard, feeling the impact reverberate through his legs, but he had no time to dwell on the pain. The raptors snarled from the top of the cliff, eyeing him with frustration. The respite didn't last long. One of the raptors, displaying an intelligence that caught Jigsaw by surprise, began to claw at the cliff, looking for a way down. Another attempted to climb around a nearby slope, following his scent. The realization was chilling. These weren't mindless animals. They were coordinated hunters, intelligent enough to strategize. Jigsaw knew he needed to move quickly before they found a way down. The river valley stretched out before him, a maze of jagged rocks, lush vegetation, and most enticingly, flowing water. His immediate survival needs came rushing back. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and in need of a plan that would give him even a slight advantage in this hostile environment. He made his way toward the river, cautious of the larger rocks where other predators might be lurking. As he approached the river's edge, he knelt down, scanning his surroundings. The thick, marshy banks seemed devoid of any immediate threats, but he knew better than to let his guard down. He drank sparingly from his portable filtration unit, careful not to draw too much attention. His senses remained heightened, attuned to any sudden shifts in the jungle's aura. As he surveyed the river, a flash of movement caught his eye. Just beyond the riverbank, a creature resembling a large, armored reptile lumbered through the mud. It was a triceratops, its thick, horned skull gleaming in the moonlight, and it moved with the calm confidence of an herbivore with few natural enemies. Jigsaw watched in awe. The creature looked both powerful and serene, a peaceful giant in an unforgiving world. "Imagine," Jigsaw whispered to himself, his voice tinged with amazement. "Living here, every day a struggle, yet they thrive." But the triceratops wasn't alone for long. A low growl came from the underbrush, and Jigsaw saw another creature creeping toward it. A pack of smaller predators, their scaly bodies low to the ground, their eyes fixed on their prey. They weren't raptors, but they moved with similar agility, circling the triceratops, looking for an opening. Jigsaw's survival instincts kicked in as he crouched low, careful not to draw the predator's attention. He was in the middle of a standoff, a reminder that this world didn't just belong to the strongest. It belonged to the most adaptable. He would have to think like them, use the environment and any resources available to stay ahead. Watching the creatures interact gave him an idea. If he could mimic some of their tactics, perhaps he could turn their behaviors to his advantage. Jigsaw carefully scanned the jungle for anything that could serve as a trap or deterrent. His wrist console showed a small readout of nearby geological formations, and he identified a series of caverns nestled in the cliffside a short distance upriver. He crept through the undergrowth, slipping away from the standoff and toward the caverns. The entrance was narrow, barely large enough for him to squeeze through, but once inside, it opened into a larger chamber. Jagged stalactites hung from the ceiling, and the ground was littered with rocks, creating a treacherous terrain that might slow down any creature foolish enough to chase him inside. It wasn't foolproof, but it was better than being out in the open. Satisfied with his temporary shelter, Jigsaw slumped against the cool stone wall, feeling his muscles ache from the relentless sprinting. He took a deep breath, allowing himself a brief moment of rest. He activated his wrist console scanner, assessing the cavern's stability and depth. According to the readout, the cave extended further back, with several offshoot tunnels that could provide additional hiding spots if needed. With his back against the wall and his eyes on the cave entrance, Jigsaw recorded another log entry, voice low but steady. Mission log, Earth Day 2. Found temporary refuge in a cliffside cavern. Observed predator-prey behaviors similar to Xiphosian pack tactics. Planet's inhabitants demonstrate remarkable intelligence and coordination. To survive, I'll need to adapt further, adopt their instincts. But before he could contemplate his strategy further, the sounds of scuffling reached him. His blood ran cold as he realized the raptors had likely found a way down and were now hot on his trail. The thought of facing them in the confined space of the cave was terrifying, but he was out of options. Jigsaw grabbed a fist-sized rock, hefting its weight in his hand as he crouched low, readying himself for a confrontation. The raptor's shadows flickered at the entrance, and he saw one clawed foot step inside, cautiously testing the terrain. The raptor's head peered in, its sharp eyes scanning the dimly lit cave, catching sight of him almost instantly. He hurled the rock with all his strength, hitting the creature squarely on the snout. The raptor hissed, momentarily stunned, but the impact wasn't enough to deter it. It snarled, creeping forward with renewed aggression, its packmates close behind. Jigsaw's mind raced. He needed to create a bottleneck, something that would keep the raptors from overwhelming him. Glancing around the cave, he spotted a section of loose stalactites hanging overhead. If he could dislodge them, they might create a barrier, slowing the raptors down. Frantically, he aimed his wrist console's laser cutter at the stalactites, adjusting the beam to its highest setting. He focused the beam, chipping away at the rock holding the stalactites in place. It took only seconds before they started to tremble, cracks forming along their bases. Just as the raptors advanced into the narrow section of the cave, the stalactites gave way, crashing down in a deadly rain of rock and debris. The raptors shrieked, their agile forms pinned or blocked by the fallen stalactites. A few managed to retreat, but others lay motionless beneath the rubble. Jigsaw took the opportunity to bolt deeper into the cavern, his heart pounding as he put as much distance as he could between himself and the entrance. After several winding turns, he found himself in another chamber, one where soft, blue bioluminescent fungi clung to the walls, casting an otherworldly glow across the space. Jigsaw slumped against a wall, his entire body trembling from the ordeal. For the first time since he'd landed, he allowed himself a sigh of relief. He couldn't deny the rush of satisfaction that came from outwitting his relentless pursuers, but he knew that every victory here was fleeting. The predators would regroup, and there would always be more challenges awaiting him. As he sat there, watching the faint glow of the fungi, Jigsaw had a moment of clarity. He couldn't rely solely on his technology, his intelligence, or even luck. He would have to fully immerse himself in this alien world's unforgiving rhythm, becoming both hunter and hunted, predator and prey. Mission log, he murmured into his wrist console, his voice steadier now. I've secured temporary shelter, but my resources are critically low. The creatures of this world are not just powerful, they're cunning and relentless. For now, I must abandon the mindset of an explorer. I am a survivor, and if I want to see Xiphos again, I must become a part of this world. With renewed determination, Jigsaw leaned back against the cool stone, preparing himself for the night ahead. His heart was still racing, but he knew he had to find rest, to gather strength for whatever trials awaited him at dawn. Chapter 5. Lessons from the Apex. Dawn broke across the valley, the sunlight filtering into the cavern where Jigsaw lay in a restless slumber. The blue glow of the bioluminescent fungi had faded as daylight flooded the chamber, and with it, his brief reprieve came to an end. He stirred, muscles sore from his recent escape, his mind already working to plan his next move. He had spent the entire night coiled up, clutching one of only 2 remaining plasma grenades, but his brief rest had done little to ease his exhaustion. The sound of trickling water caught his attention. Somewhere deeper within the cave, there was likely a hidden spring, which could replenish his dwindling water supply. He rose, stretching his stiff limbs, and activated his scanner to confirm the water source's direction. Sure enough, The console picked up a small underground stream further within the cave's maze-like structure. He made his way through a series of narrow passages, cautiously stepping over rocky ledges and ducking beneath low ceilings. The jungle outside had already taught him to be wary, even of seemingly safe spaces, and every shadow felt like a potential threat. Finally, he reached the stream. Cool, clear water gurgled along the rocky floor, fed by a trickle seeping through the ceiling. Jigsaw knelt, filling his portable filtration unit and taking a sip, savoring the taste. His relief, however, was short-lived. A deep rumble resonated through the cave, vibrating the stone under his feet. Jigsaw froze, glancing around, his heart pounding. The rumbling grew louder, punctuated by the heavy steps of something approaching. It wasn't the swift, calculated movement of raptors. This creature moved with the power and confidence of an apex predator. He knew instinctively that he was about to encounter something far larger and potentially more dangerous than anything he'd faced so far. Backing away slowly, Jigsaw turned off his console's light and crouched low in the shadows, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. The footsteps grew louder, and soon a massive silhouette filled the cave entrance. His pulse quickened as he took in the creature's features. A towering, muscular form covered in thick scales, a head crowned with horns and a mouth filled with dagger-like teeth. It was another Tyrannosaurus Rex. The T-Rex let out a low growl, its powerful legs tensing as it sniffed the air, catching Jigsaw's scent. The creature's size was incomprehensible, a moving mountain of muscle and hunger, and Jigsaw felt utterly insignificant. He knew he had no chance of outrunning it. His only option was to outwit it, to use its size against it somehow. Staying perfectly still, he watched the T-Rex lumber closer, its yellow eyes gleaming with an almost predatory intelligence as it scanned the cave. The T-Rex paused, its head swinging in Jigsaw's direction. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but he knew that any movement would draw its attention. Instead, he reached slowly for a rock by his side, and with careful precision hurled it toward the opposite side of the cave. The rock clattered noisily, echoing against the cave walls. The T-Rex's head snapped toward the sound, and it let out a thunderous roar before charging in that direction, its heavy steps shaking the ground. Using the distraction to his advantage, Jigsaw darted toward a nearby crevice, squeezing himself into the narrow space just as the T-Rex turned back, realizing it had been fooled. From his cramped hiding spot, Jigsaw watched the T-Rex sniff the air again, prowling the cave with frustration. His mind worked rapidly, analyzing its behavior. Despite its immense power, the creature was single-minded, focused entirely on pursuing its prey. If he could manipulate that instinct, perhaps he could keep it at bay or even use it to his advantage. The T-Rex eventually gave up its search, lumbering back toward the cave entrance. Jigsaw exhaled, waiting until he could no longer hear its footsteps before squeezing out of the crevice and making his way back toward the stream. His entire body was tense, his mind reeling from the encounter. Once he reached the stream, Jigsaw dipped his hands into the water, splashing it over his face to calm his nerves. The T-Rex had taught him a valuable lesson. Size and brute force weren't the only factors that determined survival here. The creatures of this world relied on instincts honed over millions of years, each adapted perfectly to their environment. If he wanted to survive, he would have to think like them, anticipate their behaviors, and make himself as unpredictable as they were. With renewed determination, Jigsaw gathered his bearings. He had spent enough time hiding and reacting. It was time to go on the offensive, to reclaim the terrain. He pulled out his console, scanning the nearby area for any resources he could use. His attention was drawn to a large, steep incline just outside the cave. The cliff was littered with loose rocks and boulders, objects that could be used as improvised weapons or deterrents against the creatures that threatened him. The sun was high in the sky as Jigsaw set to work, carefully positioning the rocks along the edge of the cliff, creating a makeshift barricade. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As he worked, he spotted a small creature moving through the underbrush, a feathered velociraptor-sized dinosaur sniffing around curiously. Jigsaw tensed but held his ground, observing the creature as it prowled closer. The dinosaur paused, eyeing him with a tilt of its head. Jigsaw remembered his earlier encounter with the raptors and realized that this dinosaur likely shared their same instincts, if perhaps a little less aggressive. It wasn't hunting him, it was merely curious, sensing his foreignness in the jungle. In a strange way, he felt a kinship with the creature, both of them outsiders navigating a harsh world. Taking a chance, Jigsaw crouched low, mimicking the creature's posture. He kept his movements slow and non-threatening, observing its reactions. The dinosaur cocked its head, studying him for a moment longer before it lost interest and scampered back into the trees. The encounter left Jigsaw with a renewed sense of purpose. If he could interact peacefully with some of the smaller creatures, perhaps he could even enlist them, create small diversions, or set up scenarios that would distract larger predators like the T-Rex. He was beginning to understand the jungle, not just as a place of danger, but as a system he could navigate, influence, and perhaps even exploit. Night fell quickly, and Jigsaw returned to the cavern, his makeshift barricade giving him a semblance of security. As he sat near the entrance, he set up a few small alarms with his remaining tech, sensors that would alert him to any approaching creatures. He had little left in terms of weaponry, but he was more resourceful now, attuned to the rhythm of the jungle. Looking up at the night sky, Jigsaw felt a strange sense of tranquility. He was light years from Xiphos, surrounded by beasts that saw him as little more than prey, but he was learning, adapting. He realized that surviving on Earth wasn't just about enduring its dangers. It was about becoming part of its untamed world. He recorded another log, his voice steady and confident. Mission log Earth Day 3. I encountered Earth's apex predator today. The Tyrannosaurus Rex, formidable, relentless, but predictable. I've begun to understand the patterns of this jungle, to think like the creatures that rule here. Technology alone won't save me. Survival here requires instinct, adaptability. Tomorrow I begin my plan. I will no longer simply react. I will use Earth's natural order to my advantage. Jigsaw closed his console, leaning back against the cave wall, a quiet resolve settling over him. This world may have been designed to consume the weak, but he was no longer the explorer who had stumbled onto its shores unprepared. He was a survivor now, as much a part of the jungle as the creatures that roamed it. Chapter 6. Ambush in the Jungle. Morning sunlight filtered through the jungle canopy as Jigsaw crept through the undergrowth, his senses alert. He had spent the past day honing his plan, analyzing every tactic and observation he had gathered since he arrived. His strategy was simple: turn the jungle itself into an ally. For every creature that hunted him, he would find a way to bait, mislead, or trap it. This was his chance to go on the offensive. He had chosen his battleground carefully, a dense section of forest where natural obstacles could slow down larger creatures and where he could set up traps to funnel predators into choke points. Nearby was a marshy swamp where many of the jungle's smaller prey animals hid. Jigsaw knew that where prey gathered, predators would soon follow. His first objective was to lure out the raptors. They were intelligent, coordinated, and relentless, and he knew they'd be hunting him before long. He chose an area along the jungle floor with multiple escape routes and rigged it with a series of makeshift tripwires and pitfalls. The tripwires were crude, created from vines woven tightly enough to resist pressure, but just delicate enough to snap under sudden force. He hoped they would disorient the raptors, maybe even slow them down. Jigsaw double-checked his traps, making sure they blended into the natural landscape. As he worked, he could feel the oppressive weight of the jungle pressing in on him. The usual chorus of bird calls and insect chirps had fallen silent, replaced by the unmistakable tension that settled before a hunt. Every instinct in him knew he was being watched. Moving with calculated silence, Jigsaw made his way to a fallen tree trunk where he had left the remnants of his last meal as bait. He added a few of his own synthetic food rations, ensuring the scent would linger and attract any curious hunters. Then, retreating to a nearby hiding spot, he crouched low, camouflaging himself behind the twisted roots of a tree. The first to appear were the raptors, 5 of them, their heads swiveling as they sniffed the air. The lead raptor let out a low hiss, signaling its pack to spread out and approach the bait with caution. Jigsaw watched them, impressed by their silent coordination. They were lean and efficient, communicating through subtle body language and sounds. But he was ready for them. As the raptors drew near the fallen log, their heads dipped low, sniffing at the bait. Suddenly, one of them triggered a tripwire, and the vine snapped, causing a small avalanche of rocks to tumble from above. The raptors shrieked in surprise, scattering in every direction as they narrowly avoided the falling debris. 2 of them were caught in the chaos, temporarily stunned. With quick reflexes, Jigsaw took his chance. He aimed his wrist console's laser cutter and activated it, shining the intense beam at one of the raptor's sensitive eyes. The creature roared in pain, retreating as it pawed at its face. The pack was in disarray, and Jigsaw used the distraction to slip away, moving through the underbrush with practiced stealth. The pack regrouped quickly, but their confidence had been shaken. Jigsaw could see them looking around, searching for their elusive prey, but he was already several steps ahead, luring them deeper into his chosen battleground. He moved with speed and silence, making sure to stay downwind to avoid alerting them to his presence. When he reached the edge of the marsh, he set his next trap. Using more vines, he rigged a branch to swing downward if triggered, aiming it directly at the path the raptors would likely take. He carefully placed pieces of broken equipment and scraps of his rations as bait along the route, marking it subtly so the raptors would follow. Then he positioned himself in a tree, hidden among the dense foliage, and waited. It wasn't long before the raptors appeared, still scanning the ground for any sign of him. The leader sniffed at the bait, chittering excitedly as it signaled for the others to follow. They moved cautiously, but their hunger made them careless. The lead raptor stepped on the hidden vine, and with a sudden snap, the branch swung down, striking it with enough force to knock it off balance. The other raptors panicked, hissing and snapping at each other in confusion as they tried to navigate the unfamiliar terrain. Jigsaw seized the opportunity, throwing a rock to one side to further disorient them. The raptors turned toward the noise, distracted, and he slipped down from the tree, retreating further into the swamp. It was then that he heard a new sound, a deep, rumbling growl that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Jigsaw spun around to see the towering silhouette of the Tyrannosaurus Rex emerging from the trees, its eyes fixed on the raptors. The massive predator had been drawn by the noise and the scent of fresh meat, and now it was zeroing in on the vulnerable raptors with ruthless efficiency. Jigsaw held his breath, watching as the T-Rex thundered forward, teeth bared in a powerful display of dominance. The raptors scattered, screeching in terror as they darted through the trees, but the T-Rex was faster. It lunged, its massive jaws snapping down on the lead raptor, crushing it with a sickening crunch. The other raptors bolted, vanishing into the jungle, unwilling to challenge the apex predator. With the raptors eliminated, Jigsaw took advantage of the momentary chaos and retreated further into the swamp. He moved carefully, stepping between tufts of grass and shallow pools of water, making as little noise as possible. But his heart pounded as he sensed the T-Rex's attention shift back to him. It lifted its head, sniffing the air, catching his scent. Jigsaw didn't waste time. He shed his suit and most of his remaining gear, then sprinted through the swamp, weaving between trees and ducking behind large rocks as he tried to outpace the T-Rex. His heart raced as the ground shook with each of the predator's massive footsteps, the scent of ancient decay filling the air. Ahead of him, he saw the cliffs where he had first encountered the raptors. An idea took shape, and he altered his course, running toward the steep incline. He knew he couldn't outrun the T-Rex forever, but he might be able to trap it, using its own weight and momentum against it. As he reached the cliffside, Jigsaw spotted a narrow ledge just wide enough to stand on. Without hesitation, he leapt onto it, pressing his back against the stone. The T-Rex stormed toward him, its massive head lowering as it closed in. At the last second, Jigsaw threw a handful of loose rocks at the T-Rex's eyes, blinding it momentarily. The beast roared in rage, shaking its head as it stumbled forward, unable to see. With a deafening crash, the T-Rex lost its footing, tumbling forward over the edge of the cliff. The earth trembled as the massive creature plummeted down, crashing into the rocks below with a final echoing roar. Jigsaw slumped against the cliffside, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. He had survived. He had outsmarted the most formidable predator in the jungle. His body ached, his mind reeling from the intensity of the hunt, but he felt an overwhelming sense of triumph. For the first time since arriving on this hostile planet, he realized he was more than just a visitor. He had become a part of its brutal primal cycle. Taking a moment to catch his breath, Jigsaw recorded a quick log entry. Mission log, Earth Day 4. Ambush successful. T-Rex neutralized using local terrain. I've adapted to this world's rhythm, and its creatures are no longer obstacles but tools. Today marks a turning point. I am no longer the hunted. I am a part of this ecosystem. With a weary smile, Jigsaw took one last look at the jungle stretching out before him. He knew his mission was far from over, and that new challenges awaited. But for the first time, he felt ready. He was no longer just an alien explorer on Earth. He was a survivor, as fierce and adaptable as the creatures that roamed this wild ancient world. Chapter 7. Allies of the Jungle. The days blurred together as Jigsaw continued to navigate the hostile environment, surviving through wits, cunning, and the occasional stroke of luck. His bond with the jungle had evolved from mere endurance to a mutual understanding. He had mapped out the landscape, familiarizing himself with the creatures' territories, their habits, and most importantly, how he could use these to his advantage. Yet, as he trekked deeper into the jungle one misty morning, Jigsaw sensed he was being followed, not by raptors or lumbering giants, but something smaller, quieter. He slowed his pace, intentionally rustling some leaves, hoping to bait out his pursuers. A rustle in the bushes confirmed his suspicions. Jigsaw stayed motionless, focusing on the barely perceptible movement. A trio of small, feathered dinosaurs stepped into the clearing. They were about the size of large birds, with sharp, curious eyes and colorful feathers that shimmered in shades of green and blue. He recognized them from his earlier research. Troodons, known for their intelligence and agility. They cocked their heads, watching him with a mix of caution and curiosity. They didn't seem hostile, but Jigsaw remained cautious, not wanting to startle them. Experimentally, he reached into his ration pouch, breaking off a piece of dried fruit. Slowly, he placed it on the ground and took a few steps back, crouching low to seem less intimidating. The Troodons tilted their heads in unison, studying the food with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. One of them, bolder than the others, darted forward, snatching up the fruit before retreating to the safety of its companions. They chittered to one another, making soft cooing noises that Jigsaw couldn't interpret, but recognized as communication. He held out another piece of fruit, keeping his posture relaxed. "I don't mean you any harm," he said softly, though he knew they couldn't understand his words. "I'm just trying to survive here, just like you." The Troodons continued to study him, their wariness melting into cautious trust as they accepted more food. Eventually, they came closer, one of them even daring to sniff at his boot. A slow smile spread across Jigsaw's face. Perhaps he could use their intelligence to his advantage. The Troodons soon became his unexpected companions, following him through the jungle at a distance, foraging nearby but never straying too far. He watched them, learning from their behaviors. They moved through the jungle with an almost uncanny awareness, picking up on dangers before they even appeared. When the Troodons tensed or darted for cover, Jigsaw quickly followed suit, trusting their instincts. One afternoon, as they traversed a dense thicket, the Troodons suddenly froze, their bodies tense, eyes locked on a nearby patch of trees. Jigsaw followed their gaze and saw what had spooked them, a massive snake-like creature coiled around a tree trunk, its mottled scales blending seamlessly into the bark. The creature's eyes, however, were fixed on the Troodons, its long body twitching in anticipation. Realizing the danger, Jigsaw reached into his belt, pulling out one of his last remaining stun charges. He activated it and threw it toward the snake, the device emitting a low hum before delivering a powerful electric pulse upon impact. The snake recoiled, hissing as it released its hold on the tree, and slithered off into the underbrush. The Troodons let out a series of relieved chirps, looking at Jigsaw with what he swore was a sense of gratitude. He patted one of them gently on the head, murmuring a quiet assurance. "Don't mention it." That night, as they camped in a makeshift shelter he had constructed from branches and leaves, Jigsaw studied the stars through the thin canopy above. His heart ached with a longing for home, for the familiar skies of Xiphos. But he knew he couldn't afford to lose focus. His only chance of survival was to remain fully present in this jungle, relying on every resource it offered. The Troodons huddled close to him, their small bodies providing unexpected warmth. He felt a surprising comfort in their presence, a reminder that, even here, alliances could be forged. And alliances, he knew, might mean the difference between life and death, in a world where survival was a constant battle. The next day, he put his newfound alliance to the test. He had scouted an area rich with edible plants and small animals, a prime feeding ground. But he also knew it was frequented by some of the jungle's most dangerous predators. If he could lure one of those creatures into a carefully constructed trap, he could neutralize it, making the area safer for both him and the Troodons. The plan required coordination, and he spent hours coaxing the Troodons, using signals and gestures to direct them. Surprisingly, they picked up on his cues, following his directions with an intelligence that reminded him of the trained animals back on Xiphos. Their cooperation emboldened him, filling him with a sense of purpose. As evening approached, Jigsaw and the Troodons reached the designated spot. He laid out bait and positioned himself in a tree overlooking the area, his laser cutter and last plasma grenade ready. The Troodons spread out, chittering quietly to one another as they watched the area with keen eyes. Their wait was short. The predator, a large, sleek theropod with dark, mottled scales, emerged from the shadows, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the bait. The Troodons remained perfectly still, waiting for Jigsaw's signal. When the creature was directly beneath him, Jigsaw tossed a rock into the underbrush, drawing the theropod's attention away from the Troodons. The predator turned, muscles tensing as it investigated the noise. At Jigsaw's signal, the Troodon sprang into action, darting around the theropod in a coordinated display of agility and speed. They harried it, nipping at its legs and tail, keeping it disoriented. Seizing his moment, Jigsaw activated the plasma grenade and dropped it from his position in the tree. It landed near the theropod's feet, emitting a high-pitched whine before exploding in a brilliant flash of light and heat. The theropod let out a deafening roar, staggering as it tried to flee, but it was too late. The grenade's shockwave knocked it to the ground, and it lay still. The Troodons circled the fallen predator, chirping excitedly, their eyes gleaming with a sense of triumph. Jigsaw climbed down from the tree, surveying the scene with satisfaction. Together, they had succeeded in taking down a creature that would have been a deadly threat on his own. Kneeling beside the Troodons, he gave them each a small piece of food as a reward. They chirped in appreciation, nudging his hand with their snouts. In that moment, Jigsaw felt a strange but powerful sense of camaraderie. They were an unlikely team, a stranded alien and a trio of ancient feathered hunters, but they had found a way to coexist, even thrive together. He recorded a quick log entry, noting the alliance he had formed and its effectiveness in taking down a major threat. Mission log, Earth Day 5. Troodon Alliance established. We've successfully eliminated a large predator, reducing local risks and securing more resources. Mutual trust is growing, survival rate increasing. That night, as he rested with the Troodons by his side, Jigsaw realized how much he had changed. He was no longer the isolated explorer, desperately clinging to technology and protocols. He was something else now, something forged by the jungle's relentless demands and tempered by its primal alliances. He had become part of the rhythm of this world, moving in sync with its creatures, learning from them, and in turn, teaching them. In a way, Earth had transformed him, making him not just a survivor, but an ally of its ancient, untamed spirit. And as he drifted into a rare, restful sleep, Jigsaw knew that whatever lay ahead, he was no longer facing it alone. Chapter 8. The Jungle's Final Test. Dawn broke over the jungle, casting an amber glow over the landscape. Jigsaw awoke to the gentle nudging of his Trudon companions, who chittered and tilted their heads, eyes scanning the nearby trees. Something felt different today, a calm before a storm. Every instinct in Jigsaw's body warned him that this day would bring a critical test. His alliance with the Trudons, his adapted survival skills, and every ounce of his courage would be put to trial. After a quick meal, Jigsaw activated his wrist console to check his resources. He was running low on supplies, and his distress beacon had still received no reply. Either no one was close enough to receive it, or his signal was simply lost in Earth's atmospheric noise. He shook off the frustration. Dwelling on escape was a luxury he couldn't afford. As he prepared to move out, the Trudons suddenly froze, their gaze fixated on something in the distance. Jigsaw followed their line of sight, his stomach sinking at what he saw, a massive figure emerging from the dense foliage. It was the Spinosaurus, the most formidable predator in this part of the jungle, and from the scars on its hide, Jigsaw recognized it as the same one he had narrowly escaped on his first day. The Spinosaurus sniffed the air, catching their scent, and its eyes locked onto Jigsaw. It let out a guttural roar that echoed through the trees, sending a tremor through the earth beneath his feet. The Trudons backed up, chirping in alarm, and Jigsaw took a deep breath, steeling himself. He couldn't run, not this time. This predator would pursue him relentlessly, and the jungle itself had brought them together for a final confrontation. Quickly, Jigsaw formulated a plan. He had no more grenades, no more laser cutters. He was down to his last energy cell, barely enough to power his wrist console for anything substantial. But he did have the jungle, and perhaps more importantly, the trust of his Trudon allies. He gave the Trudons a quick signal, directing them to a patch of thick, thorny underbrush. They followed, understanding his intent even without words. Together they moved quickly through the dense vegetation, the Trudons staying close by his side. The Spinosaurus followed, its massive form crashing through the trees as it closed the distance between them. Jigsaw led the Trudons toward a ravine he had scouted the day before. It was narrow but deep, filled with loose rock and thick mud, a natural trap if he could position it correctly. His pulse quickened as they approached the ravine, with the Spinosaurus only a few dozen meters behind. The ground shook with each step of the massive predator. At the edge of the ravine, Jigsaw paused, looking back to assess the Spinosaurus's speed and movement. It slowed momentarily, scanning the area as it noticed the sudden change in terrain. Jigsaw used that moment to gather his Trudon allies around him, motioning for them to stay low and quiet as he watched the Spinosaurus carefully. Jigsaw activated his wrist console, directing the last bit of energy into a holographic decoy. A shimmering version of himself appeared a few meters away, projected just over the ravine's edge. The Spinosaurus, its predator's instinct triggered by the sight of movement, lunged toward the decoy. Its powerful legs propelled it forward, claws tearing through the earth as it prepared to strike. Just as the massive creature reached the edge, Jigsaw commanded the Trudons to scatter. They darted to either side, distracting the Spinosaurus with sudden, rapid movements. The beast faltered, its momentum too strong to stop. With a bellow of rage, it skidded forward, its enormous bulk slipping over the loose rocks at the edge. The ground gave way beneath it, and with a tremendous roar, the Spinosaurus tumbled into the ravine, crashing into the rocks below. Jigsaw watched as the beast struggled, attempting to climb out, but the mud and debris held it in place. The Spinosaurus thrashed, roaring in frustration, but it was too exhausted, its weight working against it. After a few moments, it lay still, defeated. The jungle around him fell silent. Jigsaw took a deep breath, relief flooding over him. He turned to the Trudons, who watched the ravine with wide eyes. He crouched beside them, offering a piece of dried fruit in gratitude. The Trudons accepted it, chirping softly, and he knew that this victory belonged as much to them as to him. As he collected himself, he felt a faint vibration from his wrist console, a signal. His distress beacon had finally been detected. He checked the console, and to his disbelief, a faint but steady signal from Xiphos appeared on the screen. His rescue was on its way. The jungle around him seemed to relax as well, as if acknowledging the end of his ordeal. Jigsaw spent the next few hours with his Trudon allies, moving through the jungle one last time, appreciating the landscape that had nearly been his grave but had also been his greatest teacher. By dusk, Jigsaw heard the low hum of a Zephosian scout ship breaking through the atmosphere. A brilliant beam of light cut through the trees, casting the area in an otherworldly glow. Jigsaw waved, signaling to the ship as it descended. When it landed, Jigsaw took a last look at his Trudon friends. They watched him with quiet understanding, seeming to sense that he was leaving. He knelt beside them, offering a final piece of fruit and whispering, "Thank you." With a heavy heart, he turned and boarded the ship. As it lifted off, he watched the jungle recede beneath him, the canopy closing over the world he had come to know as both enemy and ally. His Trudon companions disappeared into the foliage, their bright feathers blending seamlessly with the lush green as if they had never been there at all. The journey back to Zephos was quiet. Jigsaw spent his time debriefing, logging his experiences in meticulous detail. But deep down, he knew that no report could capture the essence of what he had learned. The jungle had changed him, forcing him to confront his fears, his limits, and his place in a world so alien and yet so familiar. Months later, back on Zephos, Jigsaw would often look up at the night sky, his gaze drawn to the blue and green speck of Earth. To others, it was just a hostile, primitive world. But to Jigsaw, it was the place where he had forged bonds, both with the jungle's creatures and with the wild, untamed spirit that lived within him. And somewhere, deep in that ancient jungle, his Trudon allies continued to roam, keeping watch over their territory, as much a part of the jungle as the leaves and the wind. In a way, he would always be with them, his spirit entwined with the ancient rhythms of Earth, the place that had forever reshaped him into both survivor and friend of a world lost to time.